Have you ever heard the story of the woman who stole billions from the elderly, vanished across borders, hid inside a London mansion, and lived like royalty while an empire of victims collapsed behind her? If you haven't, you're about to. Before we dive in, make sure you like this video and subscribe for more stories just like this, because eLearn College brings you a crime saga so surreal it could have been written for a thriller, but every moment of it is real. It begins with a name few in the West had heard until the day her front door was kicked in by British police: Qian Zhimin. To the thousands of Chinese pensioners entrusting their life savings to her, she wasn't a criminal. She was hope. She was brilliance. She was poetry. She was wealth itself. They called her Hua Hua, little flower, soft voice, gentle words, a dream sold in whispers. But behind the soft smile was a woman quietly constructing one of the most audacious frauds of the decade. The story starts years earlier in China, where Qian founded a company with an elegant, futuristic name, Lantian Gerui, Bluesky Greet. It promised to mine cryptocurrency using cutting-edge hardware and return extraordinary profits. Every day, every investor would see their account balance rise just a little. Every day, their trust deepened, and every day the trap closed tighter. What no one realized was that the company wasn't mining Bitcoin. It wasn't investing in health technologies. It wasn't building anything. It was siphoning. It was feeding off loneliness, patriotism, and the fragile aspirations of the elderly. And then, without warning, Qian vanished. In September 2017, as Chinese authorities began to examine the cracks spreading through her empire, she slipped out of the country under a fake passport, leaving behind more than 100,000 desperate victims who still believed her promises. She traveled thousands of miles until she arrived in London, carrying with her a secret so vast it would become one of the largest cryptocurrency hauls ever seized in British history. She settled in Hampstead, in a mansion that seemed almost lifted from a film set, leafy, quiet, enormous. The rent alone was more than £17,000 a month. Most people would wonder how a newcomer with no traceable wealth could afford such luxury. But Qian had no such worries. She had tens of thousands of Bitcoin hidden away, digital fortune, invisible, untouchable, a fortune that in 4 short years would skyrocket 20-fold. She arrived not as a fugitive, but as someone who believed deeply in her own untouchability. But even in exile, Qian had a problem. Her Bitcoin, as vast as it was, lived in a world she could not touch. She needed cash to maintain her lifestyle. And so she created a new identity, a persona as extravagant as her mansion, an antiques heiress, a diamond collector, a wealthy, sophisticated woman with generational wealth behind her. Her new life required staff, and she hired a young woman named Wen Jian, once a takeaway worker, now trusted assistant. Wen's job was simple: convert Qian's cryptocurrency into cash, into jewelry, into property, whatever could keep her life in London afloat. And so the conversion began. While Wen executed her orders, Qian withdrew into a life of pure indulgence. The assistant later told the court that Qian spent her days not plotting, not panicking, but lying on her bed, gaming, shopping online, and sketching a future so delusional it seemed impossible to believe. She wrote plans in her diary, plans to build an international bank, plans to buy a castle in Sweden, plans to become Queen of Liberland, a tiny, unrecognized patch of marshland on the Danube. Qian believed she would rule it by 2022. She believed she would shape its destiny. She believed the world was hers to sculpt. But reality has a way of fracturing delusions. It began with a house, a very big house. Wen had found a grand property in Totteridge Common, a place famous for concealment, long driveways, and the kind of wealth where neighbors rarely ask questions. Qian wanted it. It was perfect. A fortress, a symbol, a new throne. But when Wen tried to purchase it on her behalf, the agents asked one simple question no one had ever dared ask Qian before. Where exactly was all this money coming from? Wen couldn't answer. Not coherently, not consistently. No paperwork, no audits, no history. and for the first time since arriving in the UK, Qian's perfect facade trembled. The unanswered questions sparked curiosity. Curiosity led to suspicion. Suspicion led to the Metropolitan Police. And suspicion was all they needed. When detectives peered into her world, they found nothing but shadows. A woman with no legal income, a stranger with no past, a mansion paid for in cash, endless Bitcoin moving through digital wallets, secret transfers, strange behavior. Lone staff brought into the country on illegal arrangements. Something wasn't just off, it was screaming for attention. The investigation quickened. Police raided the Hampstead mansion, expecting to find a few digital wallets, maybe a sophisticated laundering system, perhaps evidence of fraud. What they found instead stunned them into silence. Hard drives, laptops, backup devices, and within them tens of thousands of Bitcoin. At today's value, billions of pounds. It was one of the largest single cryptocurrency seizures in UK history. A digital mountain that represented the savings, the hopes, the futures, and the trust of more than 120,000 victims spread across every province in China. And the woman at the center of it all lay in bed upstairs, quiet, composed, as officers stormed through her house. But to truly understand the magnitude of what she had done, you have to return to China, back to the early days of her empire, when Lantian Gerui was transforming into a movement, not just a company. Investors were drawn into enormous banquets, motivational conferences, neon-lit auditoriums where patriotic music boomed through speakers and slogans promised wealth, progress, and national pride. There were endorsements, speeches, even appearances from figures tied to the highest levels of the country's revolutionary history, including, investors claim, the son-in-law of Chairman Mao himself. For elderly Chinese citizens who worshipped that era, who grew up believing in sacrifice, duty, and loyalty, this was irresistible. The company marketed itself not just as a profitable investment, but as a patriotic mission, lifting China to global dominance through technology and innovation. Middle-aged couples, widows, pensioners, they believed they were building a new future for their nation. And it worked. Millions flowed in. Families took out loans, borrowed from relatives, reinvested every daily payout. They believed the returns were real because they saw daily trickles of cash, small but reliable, enough to feel safe, enough to silence doubt. But behind the scenes, the entire system was a cycle of deception. New investments funded old payouts. Hope fed greed, greed fed expansion, expansion fed collapse. And collapse was coming. Because in 2017, the Chinese authorities noticed the cracks. Reports began to surface. The daily payouts stopped. Managers reassured investors that everything was fine, that inspections were temporary, that the government simply needed confirmation. But by the time anyone realized why the payouts truly stopped, Qian was already gone. Gone with billions, gone with encrypted drives, gone with dreams she had ignited and then extinguished. Gone to London. Gone to a city where she believed her wealth would dissolve into the noise of international finance. Gone to a country where she imagined no one would connect her to the empire of broken promises she left behind. But what Qian didn't realize was that the loneliness she exploited, the patriotism she manipulated, and the dreams she smothered were about to become the very forces pushing her downfall into motion. Because while Qian lived in luxury, her victims unraveled. Mr. Yu, one of the early investors, remembers the moment his daily payouts stopped. At first, he told himself it was a technical glitch. Everyone did. They trusted the company, the smooth-talking promoters, the patriotic speeches, the poems Qian herself wrote, delicate lines about caring for the elderly, lines about devotion, loyalty, love. Those poems were shared on her blog like scripture. Investors memorized them. They believed in her. Love the elderly with the passion of a first romance, she wrote. Words so tender they became the emotional trap she set for tens of thousands of people. But after the police arrived, the truth sank in. The company wasn't facing temporary checks. It wasn't reorganizing. It wasn't preparing to resume payouts. It was gone. The managers who reassured investors had been bought off. The daily income was revealed to be nothing but redistribution from new victims to old ones, and at the heart of it all, little flower, Hua, had taken everything. When the shock hit, it devastated entire families. For Mr. Yu, the losses were crushing. He and his wife had each invested 60,000 yuan, believing they'd secure their future. But then they reinvested their profits. They took out loans with steep interest. They kept pouring more money in, convinced their loyalty would be rewarded in the end. It wasn't. The financial pressure broke his marriage. The shame fractured his relationship with his son. And while he survived, others didn't. Mr. Yu knew a woman from Tianjin, elderly, frail, who had poured all her remaining money into Qian's scheme, dreaming her final years would be comfortable. When the money disappeared, she discharged herself from hospital. She couldn't afford her treatment. She died of breast cancer shortly after. Her last request to Mr. Yu was haunting. She asked him to write her elegy, and he did. He wrote, "Let us be pillars holding up the sky, rather than sheep to be led and misled." It wasn't just grief, it was fury, and it spread. By the time British police raided the Hampstead mansion, the victims, scattered across all 31 provinces of China, were connected by a shared tragedy. And when they heard of Qian's arrest, hope resurfaced, not for revenge, but for survival. Because the Bitcoin she brought to the UK was the only thing that could bring any of them back from ruin. But retrieving that wealth would become a battle on an entirely different front. Meanwhile, inside the UK, Qian was entering the next phase of her delusion-driven life. After the raid, the investigation deepened. Police tracked her movements, her assistants, her financial footprint, and the people quietly working in the shadows of her York residence. When officers burst through her doors in April, they found not just Qian, calm, composed as though she had expected them, but 4 other individuals, domestic staff, cleaners, a security guard, all brought into the country illegally, all working solely for her personal comfort. She wasn't living in exile. She was living in a self-made kingdom. As the evidence mounted, her narrative shifted. At first, she denied everything. She told investigators she was fleeing a Chinese government crackdown on crypto entrepreneurs. She said she was innocent, misunderstood, persecuted. She claimed she had earned her wealth legitimately. But then the evidence began to speak louder than her lies. The hard drives, the Bitcoin wallets, the trail of victims, the diary filled with fantasies of power and royalty, and the assistants whose words painted a portrait of a woman deeply disconnected from reality. Wen Jian's testimony was damning. She told the court that Qian spent her days lying in bed, immersed in mobile games, scrolling through shopping apps, while giving orders to shift immense sums of Bitcoin into new forms. She said Qian slept late, rarely left her room, and existed in a haze of luxury and detachment. And yet Qian wasn't idle. She was planning. Her diary revealed meticulous schemes stretching 6 years into the future. She wrote of founding an international bank. She wrote of buying a Swedish castle. She wrote of manipulating a British duke into supporting her ambitions. And most bizarrely, she wrote of ruling Liberland, a 7-square-kilometer patch of uninhabited wetlands between Croatia and Serbia. She had allocated millions for its development, convinced she would become its queen. But the court wasn't interested in her fantasies. It was interested in the billions in her possession. The Crown Prosecution Service concluded that over 40 billion yuan, about PS 4.2 billion, had been poured into her company by more than 100,000 victims. They argued that the Bitcoin in her drives represented the stolen savings of those people. They seized it all. And soon the weight of the evidence forced Qian to fold. In September, she unexpectedly pleaded guilty. Not to fraud because her company was outside UK jurisdiction, but to illegally acquiring and possessing cryptocurrency. To put it plainly, she admitted she knew the Bitcoin she brought into Britain came from criminal sources. Victims like Mr. Li, who invested 10 million yuan with his family, felt a strange sensation when they heard she had pleaded guilty. For years they believed she had escaped, that she would never face consequences. But this one moment, this one shift in her plea, gave them a flicker of something they had long believed was gone. A glimpse of sunlight, Mr. Li called it. Yet the path forward remains tangled, because while the criminal case has resulted in her 11-year and 8-month sentence, the future of the confiscated Bitcoin hangs in legal limbo. Thousands of victims want to make claims. Chinese lawyers are preparing evidence. But there is a catch. Many of the victims didn't pay Qian's company directly. They handed money to local promoters. Promoters handed money to regional distributors. Only then did it reach the core of the scheme. Tracing it back is a labyrinth of broken promises and vanished documents. And once victims do establish their claims, there's another unresolved question. Will they receive the amount they originally invested, or the amount their Bitcoin is worth today? Because the value of those coins has skyrocketed more than 20-fold since the day Qian boarded that plane to London. If victims receive only their original contribution, the remainder will, by law, go to the UK government. If they receive the inflated value, the payout will be record-breaking. Either way, someone stands to make billions. The Treasury has remained silent, and beneath it all lies something darker. Because Qian herself had written, privately, secretly, that she intended to repay her victims eventually, but only once Bitcoin hit $50,000 per coin. She believed that moment would absolve her. She believed that wealth would redeem her. She believed she could rewrite her own story. But Bitcoin hit $50,000, and she didn't return a single yuan. She was too busy chasing her delusions of royalty. Now she sits in a cell, her dreams dashed, her kingdom dismantled, her plans scattered like dust. Yet the consequences of her actions stretch far beyond her prison walls into the lives of the thousands she left behind. People who still wait for justice. People who still live in debt. People who still carry the memory of trust betrayed. And for many of them, especially those who lost family, homes, or health, justice, if it ever comes, will arrive far too late. And that is the true shadow lingering over the story of Qian Zhimin. Because while she sits behind bars, while courts debate the fate of her billions, the human wreckage she left behind continues to deepen. Scars like hers do not fade quickly, and in some communities, they may never heal. In the weeks after her guilty plea, a strange sense of duality took over the victim groups. On one side, there was relief, a reassurance that the world had not forgotten them, a belief that justice, however partial, had finally caught up with the woman who dismantled their futures. But on the other side, there was bitterness, rage, a knowledge that no sentence, no courtroom ritual, no press headline could ever return the years lost, the families broken, or the lives destroyed. And as British reporters dug deeper into Qian's past, they uncovered unsettling patterns that stretched far beyond simple greed. They found that Qian didn't need to use threats, violence, or intimidation. She didn't manipulate with force. She manipulated with hope. She crafted an illusion so irresistible that people willingly walked into it. Some begged to enter it. They believed in her more deeply than they had believed in themselves. To them, she wasn't a criminal. She was a savior, a visionary, an angel wrapped in the language of prosperity. But every illusion reaches its breaking point. Behind the banquets, behind the patriotic anthems, behind the neon-lit stages where her promoters spoke like prophets of abundance, there were whispers about how someone so important, so wealthy, so revered could never be seen in public. Investors rarely saw her face. She communicated through poems rather than speeches. She appeared only to the wealthiest investors, people like Mr. Li, who described meeting her as though they were stepping into the presence of a deity. He called her their goddess of wealth, and she encouraged that worship. She cultivated it. because loyalty was the fuel her empire required. And yet, for all her apparent intelligence, for all the meticulous detail in her schemes, she made one fatal miscalculation. She believed she could outrun her own past. She believed that once she stepped onto British soil, the world she left behind would simply dissolve. That her victims, scattered across China, would eventually accept their losses as a cautionary tale. That the authorities would forget her. That fortune would hide her. That Bitcoin, multiplied 20-fold by the unpredictable winds of the market, would wash away the sins that created it. But crimes built on the bodies of the vulnerable have a way of echoing. They travel, they cross borders, they sit in the back of minds and the bottom of emails. They linger until someone decides to look twice at a mansion that shouldn't exist, or a transaction that doesn't make sense, or a buyer whose story doesn't add up. And so the echoes reached London. When police cracked open the encrypted drives in her Hampstead home, they didn't just find wealth. They found motive. They found history. They found a digital mausoleum of broken trust. And as the evidence grew, Qian's world shrank, from a mansion to a courtroom and from a courtroom to a cell. The judge, Sally-Ann Hales, said it plainly during sentencing. You were the architect of this offending from its inception to its conclusion. Your motive was pure greed. No ambiguity, no forgiveness, no sympathy. 11 years and 8 months. But for the victims listening from around the world, the number felt fragile. Too small for a crime so broad, too brief for suffering so deep. Yet it was something. And after years of silence, something felt monumental. Even now, as her future unfolds behind prison walls, the legal battle over her Bitcoin fortune remains one of the most complex proceeds of crime cases the UK has handled. Thousands of victims are preparing to present evidence, hoping to prove they contributed to the pool of money she converted into cryptocurrency. But because the flow of funds went through chains of promoters, distributors, and intermediaries, many fear they will be unable to prove their claims at all. And if they cannot, the remaining billions, after verified claims are honored, will legally default to the UK government. This possibility creates an uncomfortable moral tension, a government profiting from a fraud committed against foreign pensioners, a nation holding the remnants of dreams stolen thousands of miles away, and a courtroom system trying to balance legality with compassion. Even the UK's Crown Prosecution Service remains cautious about promising too much. They've considered a compensation scheme for unrepresented victims, but no details have been shared. No timelines, no guarantees. And so in China, victims wait. They wait in shared online groups. They wait in dim apartments filled with past due notices. They wait in homes where trust has become a fragile, wounded thing. They wait with anger, with sadness, with resignation. Some, like Mr. Yu, fight not just for themselves but for those who didn't survive long enough to see justice begin. His marriage is gone. His wealth is gone. His relationship with his son is a ghost of what it once was. And yet, with a sense of duty, he continues to speak, to share his story, to demand accountability. He still keeps the elegy he wrote for the woman from Tianjin. He reads it sometimes, not out of grief, but to remind himself what blind trust can cost. Behind the statistics, behind the billions, behind the news stories and court documents, this is what Qian's empire really left behind. A trail of human loss that cannot be measured in numbers. And as for Qian herself, she now faces years in confinement, far from the luxuries she once believed she deserved. No more castles, no more dukes, no more delusions of royalty. Her dreams of ruling Liberland have evaporated into the same thin air that carried her lies. Yet even now, somewhere in a cold file room, locked behind layers of encryption and legal barriers, her Bitcoin remains, waiting, growing. A reminder of how far a single person's ambition can reach when fed by greed and shielded by fantasy. Her story is not one of brilliance. It is one of manipulation. It is the story of a woman who understood the emotional vulnerabilities of the elderly better than she understood morality. And it is the story of thousands who trusted the wrong voice, followed the wrong dream, and paid the highest price. And so, as we close this chapter, one question remains. How many more empires like hers are out there? Quiet, hidden, digital, waiting for the moment they collapse. If you've never heard this story before, now you have. And if you want to hear more stories like this, real, raw, unfiltered, and as gripping as the truth can be, make sure you like this video and subscribe for more. Because the world is full of tales like this one, and we're just getting started.